Okay, so we have finally arrived at some novels that you have probably heard of. Mary Shelley's um, Frankenstein, sorry, um, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So these are all sort of novels that we generally think of as horror novels, although in a lot of ways Frankenstein has been reclaimed or claimed as the first or one of the first science fiction novels, and I think you can read it. You can read it either way, but let's do Frankenstein last. So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It is basically the story of someone who finds or invents a potion that causes a repressed part of his behavior to physically manifest. So we have some of the key ideas of the Gothic going on here. You have science. You have a new technology, in this case, chemistry, and you have this idea of the return of something, the return of the repressed. So this is not so much like the dead coming back, but a sort of pre-societal, what we would talk about in Freudian terms as an id. We are going to have to sort of talk a little about Freud in a bit. And again, I'm sorry that these lectures are going on a really long time. You're welcome to break these up over 2 weeks. So that is the basic sort of plot of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So again, you have technology, return of the repressed. With Dracula, Dracula doesn't necessarily present itself as being a technological novel, but it's very concerned with ideas like the telegraph features very heavily. If you've never read Dracula, it's an epistolary novel. It's all forms of communication, and often these are very modern forms of communication. But also you have this idea with Dracula of the incursion of the Eastern European into England. So that is sort of like really typically Gothic. He is from the home of the Goths, and he is coming in and he is engaging in a form of sort of proprietary capitalism. He wants to learn modernity. That's why Jonathan Harker comes to Transylvania, is to sort of work through legal aspects of capitalism, but he's also training this sort of pre-modern man to be modern. So when he comes over, he represents a form of modernity that is new, and Dracula gets reread in different ways in every sort of generation, whether it's about sexuality, whether it's about sexually transmitted disease, but it is really, I think, as written, it's largely about forms of modern capital and modern ownership, and modern sort of cosmopolitan culturalism that is being introduced into England. But the big one, for our purposes, I think, is Frankenstein. Partly because it's written by Mary Shelley, partly because it's written by a female author. She's very young when she writes Frankenstein. If you don't know the basic story of it, she is married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, who's a poet, and they're at this weekend retreat with him and Lord Byron and a couple other friends, and they have a dare to see who can make the scariest story, and what comes out of it for Shelley is Frankenstein. What comes out of it for the other guys is really nothing all that interesting. So, with Frankenstein, you have, first of all, you should know that in the text, Frankenstein is not this grunting, the sort of Boris Karloff figure. He speaks. He's actually quite the Frankenstein's monster. The monster, the creature, is quite eloquent and quotes Milton a lot. He's a big Milton fan. Teaches himself. He gets taught language. He gets taught to read. But we have, in a basic sense, you have a physical body being brought back through technology, and it's weird to think of electricity as a technology, but at the time there was this idea called galvanism, that electricity was the motivating, the like life-giving, the invigorating force. So the idea of invigorating dead matter was not scientifically implausible at the time. It was like considered a theoretical possibility. Um, so Shelley's novel is really concerned with like a moment with new technology in the same way that like what the Gothic churches were excited about new architectural technologies. So again, you have this element that is quite like science fiction that is built into the Gothic, but with Frankenstein, you have this largely about this sort of the return of something from death, something that has been dead. Um, and much like Radcliffe, you have the idea of the supernatural explained. So it's, Frankenstein's creature is in some sense a revenant, a zombie, a ghost, but there is a science behind it. So that is sort of very traditionally Gothic. So those are sort of three big foundational, all British Gothic novels, and so we've been sort of laying out these ideas of the Gothic, and within the British Gothic tradition, it's the deep past that is the thing that is coming back, and to some extent, this maps onto like religious ideas that are coming back, that are returning. But when the Gothic comes to the U.S., the U.S. is not a country with a deep past, so we don't have that. We don't have hundreds of years buried in the soil, unless you consider indigenous people, which sadly enough, a lot of American literature really doesn't. So what is going to come back? What is going to be the thing that is repressed that returns in American forms of Gothic literature? And ultimately, what we're going to see is that that's race, and we're going to see that in the next lecture.